For those who don't know, Deadpool Wolverine was almost a completely different movie. It went through a lot of changes when they were making it, where there were even 25 versions of the script. Each one had a different story and cast of characters and more variants, and more returning legacy characters. One of them being Nicolas Cage's Ghost Rider, who would have been a part of the Resistance team and helping Deadpool and Wolverine at the end of the movie against all the other Deadpool variants. There were a lot of scrapped ideas for Deadpool and Wolverine that didn't make the final cut. Now I'm going to break them all down. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any of the future videos, and enjoy. Starting off, there was this piece of concept art that was released that shows us a completely different version of the final battle with the Deadpool core. And in the center, you can see our Deadpool and Wolverine fighting against the other Deadpool variants. But if you look closely, you'll see a different cast of heroes that's helping them out in this final battle. One of them being Chris Evans' Johnny Storm, revealing that at one point when they were making this movie, they had different plans for his character, and that he wouldn't have been taken out so quickly from Cassandra Nova and would have been helping them in the final battle. And to the left of him, we do see Blade, showing that he was always a contender to be in this movie, and he looks very similar to the character appearance they have in this concept art. And behind Blade, we can actually see a Deadpool variant climbing up this rock who is holding a lightsaber. And down below, we can also see a different version of Kidpool who has these dual lightsabers as well. This is also a grab from the comics because Kidpool was known for having these two sabers. They weren't officially called lightsabers, but were more of a reference to them being lightsabers because of Deadpool's fourth wall breaking. And because Marvel and Star Wars are both a part of Disney, this crossover would have been allowed to happen. But it looks like this idea didn't make it past the draft phases, as they didn't include this in the final version, and Kidpool ended up having water guns instead of real weapons. Also, if they give Kidpool these lightsabers, they would have had to have him use them against some people, and in the final battle, Kidpool didn't see any action. And then if you zoom in here in the background behind Wolverine, you'll see Ghost Rider, who's using his chains to fight against these other Deadpool variants. Ryan Reynolds shared that he talked to Nicolas Cage and they fought really hard to get him in this movie, but it ended up becoming very complicated to bring his character into this movie. And one of the main reasons we didn't see Nicolas Cage return as Ghost Rider was due to budget reasons. Now, the budgeting issues that they were talking about wasn't that Nicolas Cage was asking for too high of a price or they just couldn't afford to have him in this movie. It's more about the logistics of bringing Ghost Rider to life. And it requires more work and planning with the crew on set when they're filming the movie. Something that Sean Levy and Ryan Reynolds shared in a lot of interviews is that they were very strict on the budget and didn't want to go over. And they made it a priority not to go over the budget because they didn't want to spend too much money, and they also felt that it opened more creative opportunities with having less money to work with. So having a character like Ghost Rider who's reliant on CGI is a lot more expensive than, let's say, X-23, where you only need to add in her claws. And then up above Ghost Rider, we can see Elektra, who is kicking a T-Rex Deadpool variant, who is another Deadpool character that was grabbed from the comics that didn't make the final version. And then if you follow the nunchucks from the T-Rex, it'll lead you to Daredevil, and this would have been Ben Affleck's character from 2003, who's another character that at one point they considered having in the final battle, but they decided to just keep Elektra. And down here in the bottom right, we can see Dogpool, who would have been a different breed from what we saw in the movie, and also in other illustrations, we can see that this dog belonged to Ladypool. Instead, Dogpool ended up belonging to Nicepool, and they ended up pivoting to a different dog that Ryan Reynolds saw that won Britain's ugliest dog contest. And then he went, yeah, that's our Dogpool. This character right here would have been another grab from the comics, and this is a Deadpool variant called Champion Pool, but he's also a character with a lot of other layers, and he is connected to Thanos. He's one of the elders of the universe, and he decided to start wearing the Deadpool suit. He would have been too big of a character for them to waste in this movie as a disposable variant, so you can see why they didn't end up including him. Not only did this battle take place at a different location we saw in the final version, but it doesn't include Channing Tatum's Gambit or Daphne Keene's X-23, as they weren't considered to be in the movie at this point into production, and they were only added later down the line. Now I'm going to show us some concept art that showed us some different versions of characters we saw, and other characters that didn't make it into the movie. One of the scrap variants being titled Wolverine Pool, a blend between the two of the characters, you can only imagine the merchandise potential with this variant. He likely would have shown up with the rest of the Deadpool core at the final battle, and it would have been a pretty memorable one if included. This one doesn't have a name, so I'm just going to call him Winnie Pool, because he reminds me of Winnie the Pooh. He's a variant with these long swords and is in a pajama costume with Deadpool, but he does have these flappy ears. It looks like the Deadpool in this universe decides to fight in a pajama onesie. The next one is Punk Pool, and as in the name, he's a punk rock version of Deadpool. Covered with spikes from head to toe, he would have been pretty hard to miss if he was in the final battle, and an iconic one if that. There's also the spray-painted Avengers logo on his suit, which Ryan Reynolds also cryptically tweeted recently, to kind of hint that he's in Avengers Doomsday. I wish they kept this variant in the final version, but I think a reason why is because he looks very similar to Hobie from Spider-Verse. Because with Hobie being a fan favorite from across the Spider-Verse, and having two red masked emo punk heroes, they wouldn't want to take any chances having general audiences mix these two characters up and also infringe on another property, because they wouldn't want Sony to take any legal action if they ended up doing that, because that would cause some tension between the two properties. Okay, so there's a lot of different other Deadpool variants, and I'm just going to fly through them, so pause or rewind if you want to look at them closely. There was a maid Deadpool, chef Deadpool, creepy clown Deadpool, sailor Deadpool, a lifeguard Deadpool, a Viking Deadpool variant, and a knight variant, wrestler pool, cautionary tape zombie pool, grandma pool, pirate pool, king pool. There was a piece of concept art made showing us a baby version of Wolverine. We can assume this variant would have shown up during the Anchor Bean montage, and I'm guessing that they cut it because they didn't want to reuse material, because they had another Wolverine variant who was short and that would have been playing on the same joke. Oh look, here's a small Wolverine. And they also had Baby Pool show up at the final battle. Now this variant also takes a turn, and it would have been a feral version of Wolverine. It's when Magneto stripped the adamantium out of Wolverine's body, removing his skeleton entirely where he has to regrow his own bone claws, and it traumatized Logan and left some mental scars overall, leading to this chaotic version of Wolverine just wandering around in his own universe. Another variant that they almost included would have been the Weapon X version of Wolverine. As you can see, he's wearing a minimal amount of clothes and has all these different wires around him with a helmet on top, because this Logan was experimented on and brainwashed and used as a weapon. We did see a similar version to this variant in X-Men Apocalypse, where Jean Grey set him free and he ran into the cold wilderness, which does resemble the background that we see in this concept art. Here's another scrapped Wolverine variant, and this one is interesting because it looks like he doesn't have mutant powers. If you look at his hand, you'll notice that the claws coming out don't seem to be coming from his skin, but it seems to be attached to him with whatever is wrapped around his wrist. From the looks of it, he would have been using his claws more for mountain climbing than for combat, as he has a more G.I. Jones appearance, along with a different primary weapon. And that's because this Wolverine is a crossover with a different comic book franchise, the Wildcats, which is a smaller comic book franchise that's outside of Marvel. But they did do a crossover with the X-Men in the 90s with a limited comic book run, and the artist who made this wanted to see if they could bring back this version of Wolverine. It may have been complicated on Marvel's end to get the green light to have this crossover happen, and also due to budget reasons with them not wanting to spend too much on characters that were going to have a very short appearance to begin with. And they had a lot of different looks as to what Wolverine's costume is going to look like, because in this movie it was the first time we ever saw this Logan put on the cowl and have a comic book accurate appearance. Usually in other Marvel movies, it's common for us to see the characters get multiple costumes within it, but due to this movie taking place in the void, we weren't going to see Hugh Jackman put on different Wolverine costumes throughout the movie, as the only changes that we got to his main one were him ripping off the sleeves near the end of the movie. And there were a lot of different looks that the artist wanted Logan to wear, but it seems like they have to save them for future Marvel movies. One of the costumes actually shows us an orange and black suit taken from the X-Men Evolution cartoon. This design is quite popular among fans, but it is a little niche. This doesn't mean we're never going to see this design, as they could use it in future X-Men movies, especially when they cast a new Wolverine. Now, when they were figuring out what characters were going to be taking place in the Void and working for Cassandra, they had a couple variations of Juggernaut, one of them being a female variant of the Juggernaut from X-Men The Last Stand. This piece of artwork was developed in early stages of the movie, and they didn't have any casting in mind. But Sean Levy wanted to include some female variants of villains that we had seen in past Marvel movies. The design is very similar to the one that Vinnie Jones wore in X-Men The Last Stand, with them adding some minor changes to the costume that fit the female aesthetic of it. But at one point they did consider bringing back the original actor from X-Men The Last Stand, Vinnie Jones. He even talked about this in an interview before the movie came out, and I don't know if he was supposed to share this.
And funny enough, I just got asked to do Deadpool, the new one that's coming out now, and I spoke to the director and I just said, it's such a drama putting that suit on, you know, mentally and physically. I mean, it had its mental toll. I really wanted to do it, but they didn't have the budget to put me in the suit.
When he brings up budget reasons, I do think he's talking about the pay that they wouldn't give him, because in the movie they had a Juggernaut with the same physical look as his character, but they decided to have Aaron Reed play the Juggernaut, who was a mutual friend of Ryan Reynolds and Sean Levy, who I'm guessing would have been a more affordable option compared to Vinnie Jones. once again showing how serious Ryan Reynolds and Sean Levy were about the budget, as they didn't want to make any exceptions for going over it, no matter who it was or what characters they were bringing back. Alright, this is one I haven't seen a lot of people talk about, but it's from a previous image that was developed before they started filming, and the artist who made this designed a lot of scenes in the movie, but for this section we're going to be looking at the Ant-Man arena where Cassandra was living. And here in the middle we can see Deadpool around this metal sphere that transported Wolverine and Johnny Storm to Cassandra. And here on the left, if you look closely, this is actually the Juggernaut from Deadpool 2. And there's also another image where I think we can see him in. We have a shadow outline of a really big figure that doesn't line up with any of the other characters we saw in the movie. So I'm assuming this is Juggernaut, but I'm not too sure. But we do know one of the artists was working on this Juggernaut model for this scene at one point. There are two different reasons that I can think of as to why they didn't include this Juggernaut in the movie. One is because of the budget, because he was prominently a CGI character and would require a lot of VFX to bring him to life on the screen, opposed to hiring an actor who's just very muscularly built, and the only VFX work they would maybe need is him using his powers when he's ramming into something. And then the second reason is that this would have conflicted with the plot due to Juggernaut's helmet being a plot device used to trap Cassandra Nova. And if they went with this much larger Juggernaut, there's no way that helmet was fitting on her head unless they used some Pym particle technology. Another character that they considered bringing back was Bullseye from the 2003 Daredevil, who was played by Colin Farrell, but in the movie they did include a Bullseye variant, it's just that he was really hidden in the background. It's a little tough to see, but if you look closely you can see that there is a bullseye in his forehead. Since Ben Affleck was no longer returning, it may not have been worth it to bring Colin Farrell back as well, because people would have wanted to see a fight between the original Daredevil and Bullseye. They considered having a female variant of the villain from the first Punisher movie in 2004, the Russian, which they didn't end up doing because they had a male variant of the Russian, but they did have a female version of Quill, who we last saw in X-Men The Last Stand. Here we can see Deadpool Wolverine having an actual meal, and Deadpool seems to be reaching out for the fries, where Wolverine ends up pulling out his claws. At first I thought they were trying to reference Into the Spider-Verse, but Sean Levy wanted this to resemble the scene from Heat with Robert De Niro and Al Pacino. And behind the two of them, we can actually see some cooks and chefs making the food, showing that at one point the Void wasn't meant to be a Mad Max wasteland, and seemed to have somewhat of a normal civilization going on down there. There was also an alternative version of when Wade travels to the Earth 616 universe to audition to become an Avenger before the events of Infinity War and Endgame. And in this version he still would have met with Happy Hogan, but there was going to be another character that appeared, and that was going to be Tony Stark. We don't have any other details about the scene or the dialogue or what took place, but we do know that Tony Stark himself was going to show up. We can assume it would have played out the same way with Wade getting rejected from the Avengers, and maybe some playful banter between Ryan Reynolds and Robert Downey Jr. And Ryan Reynolds also shared that Robert Downey Jr. also read the script to this scene and looked at it, but ended up declining. But we do know the reason why this didn't happen, and that's because the summer that this movie was coming out was also when they announced Doctor Doom was going to be played by Robert Downey Jr. himself. Ryan did share that this was one of the very few no's that they got for this movie, because most actors didn't hesitate to join the project. For example, they ended up FaceTiming Henry Cavill and he said yes on the spot. It may have given people false hope that Robert Downey Jr. was going to be returning as Iron Man in the future, when they wanted to brand him as the next big bad in the MCU. If this movie was coming out a couple years before they had the idea of Robert Downey Jr. being Doctor Doom, maybe this would have happened, but because it was too close to the announcement, they had to scrap it. And speaking of Deadpool showing up in the MCU, they originally had plans for him to show up at the Battle of New York. This was really early on to development. The artist who made this shared this was before they even had a script. The idea they had in mind was that Deadpool was going to travel through a lot of different universes with the TVA tech, and one of them being the Marvel Comics universe. So this wasn't the 616 universe where the Battle of New York took place, but it was an alternative universe in a comic book style. All the Avengers here would have been wearing their original comic book appearance designs to make this more distinct and show that it wasn't taking place in the 616 universe, but it would have been a way to bring him to those events in alternative universes. There was also a similar idea that included Deadpool being a part of the MCU all along. It was shared by Wendy Jacobson, one of the producers of Deadpool and Wolverine, who shared that they wanted to include a montage at the beginning of the movie, showing a lot of bloopers from other memorable Marvel movies, and in the background they were going to show that Wade Wilson was always there, and that Deadpool was always a part of the MCU, it's just that you never saw him.
Well, that's just lazy writing.
Kevin Feige shared that when Ryan Reynolds was developing this movie, there was a total of 25 different ideas that were pitched to him, and these weren't just small changes, these were entirely different versions of what this movie was going to be. One of the early ideas was to make Deadpool 3 a low-budget movie, with a very small budget of around $5 to $10 million, and that this version was going to be a road trip movie with Dopinder and Deadpool. And this idea was conceived before the Disney and Fox merger, which brought Deadpool to the MCU, which may explain why Ryan wanted to scale it down, because there weren't really any big storylines to gravitate towards in that universe. This is another idea that they shared in an interview, and I'm not too sure if they're really serious about this one, but they pitched it to Kevin Feige himself, and that's that they wanted to do a one-to-one recreation of Thor: The Dark World, and then have Deadpool show up after the first act. Basically re-releasing a previous Marvel movie, and then having Deadpool show up as one of the side characters. Kevin Feige did nicely comment on this by saying that it was on the weaker side of the ideas that they brought to him. And it's funny to hear all these ideas because they're so different from the final movie that we got. Ryan Reynolds briefly talked about this in the Deadpool announcement video, but they really were struggling on the writing process for Deadpool 3, and once they got the idea of bringing Hugh Jackman back as Wolverine, everything just clicked. They realized they could implement the TVA to the storyline, bring back Marvel Legacy characters, and have this movie take place in the void. One of the writers even said that when Hugh came on board, the movie basically wrote itself. One idea that they had in mind, going as far back as 2021, Ryan shared that they wanted to have a one-shot style battle taking place at the end of the movie. In one of the drafts, instead of Deadpool fighting up against a bunch of variants of himself, he was going to be going up against a bunch of zombies in hell. And the villain wouldn't have been Cassandra Nova, get this, Mephisto. I'm a little skeptical of this, and I don't know if they were just baiting Marvel fans with the whole Mephisto joke, but Sean Levy said it himself, he said Mephisto. Another alternative take that Ryan Reynolds had for the story was to have a Rashomon-style movie, and there would have been one event that we saw both Deadpool and Wolverine going through, and there would have been 3 different perspectives, one from Logan's point of view, and the other from Wade's, and then the third would have likely been the truth or a different character's perspective. This would have been a more introspective movie compared to the blockbuster hit that we got, and Kevin Feige reiterated to Ryan that he had a larger scope of the MCU to explore and keep in mind, so Ryan once again had to go back to the drawing board and think of different ideas that fit into the larger scope. Now this is something they scrapped from the movie, but was also subtly included when Deadpool was at the TVA in the end credit scene, but they had an end credit scene showing that Gambit had survived, with him walking through the ruins of Cassandra's compound over the other dead X-Men characters, and he turns around when he sees something in the sky, and we can see the bright orange sparkles in his eyes. Now we don't know who was opening this portal, whether it was another sorcerer or if it was Deadpool himself, because he did still have the sling ring. I believe the reason as to why they didn't include this in the movie is because they didn't know if Gambit would return, because the whole reasoning for having Channing Tatum was to give him the chance to play the Gambit character where he never got his own solo movie for, and this movie fulfilled that wish. At the time they made this movie, there were no plans for a Gambit movie or for his character to continue, but due to the success of Deadpool and Wolverine and how he was such an iconic character, they're actually going to bring him back for Avengers Doomsday. So don't let the text Gambit will return convince you that Channing Tatum is going to be the new long-term Gambit, as he's only going to be in these next 2 Avengers movies. The scene of Deadpool getting his new suit at the TVA was also supposed to be a lot longer, where he was going to be trying on a lot of different suits. Most of these were grabs from the comics and alternative versions of Deadpool we were likely never going to see on the big screen, so this would have opened the opportunity to see Ryan Reynolds in those suits. One of them being the Age of Apocalypse version of Deadpool, which is also based on that era where we saw the Age of Apocalypse Wolverine in one of the scenes. And this gray and black one is his X-Force design from the comics, which we did get to see at the end of Deadpool 2, with an explosion and rubble causing the dust to taint the colors of his suit to give him this outline. That one was more of a reference than an official suit that he was wearing. This illustration right here shows us a costume that would have been implementing elements from all the original 6 Avengers into one suit. Obviously, the shield with the star is a reference to Captain America, but then he has this red bulky armor with a white circle in the middle, and that's an arc reactor. And then next to his head, you can see some arrows that are inside a quiver, and then there are these tiny feathers that you would see on Thor's helmet, but instead they're on Deadpool, and you can also see Deadpool's original sword on his back. And on his left arm, you can see some red hulking fists. I'm not sure if this is some sort of technology or if they're green gloves, but then on his wrist, you can see that he has the Black Widow bites. I'm a little disappointed they cut this from the movie, because I'm not sure if they're ever going to have the opportunity to display all these costumes that they did in the illustrations. There was a montage that they included of Wade and Logan wandering around in the void until they ran into Nice Pool. They went to a lot of different locations inside of the void, truly showing the scale of this world and how it's more than just a desert. And as they were cutting from different scenes, Deadpool would have been narrating over it, and he also would have been asking Logan constant questions such as, what happened to Jean? Have you seen the trailer to Tiptoes? You'll love it. A reason why they may have cut this scene and the costume fitting is due to the runtime of the movie and pacing. And he could just not stop talking and would eventually get on Logan's nerves when he tries to jump on his back and get his own piggyback ride, which also lines up with some of the set photos that leaked before the movie came out. I covered this in my video covering the leaks of Deadpool and Wolverine. I also have some other videos where I cover the scrapped ideas and leaks of other Marvel movies, so make sure to check those out. Thank you so much for watching this video, and take care.